To welcome all of you to this third in a series of talks. The first one being in January. And in this series, I'm covering, from a Buddhist perspective, the sixfold matrix of mental balance with an emphasis on each of the corresponding types of intelligence. So, cognitive intelligence, ethical intelligence. Covered this in the first lecture in January within the Bodhisattva framework, the Bodhisattva ideal, the motivation, the way of life, the Bodhisattva conduct. So there was the cognitive and there was the ethical. And then about 6 weeks ago, we turned to the third of the 6 kinds of intelligence, attentional intelligence. Covered that in some detail in 90 minutes or so. And in this sequence, from the cognitive to the ethical, the attentional, and then comes the cognitive intelligence. And that's what I will address today. And also again, about 6 weeks from now, I'll address it again, part 2. But in the presentation today, I will be drawing on classic sources of developing cognitive intelligence. But in this one uniquely, I think, in terms of all of the lectures in this series, it will go on for some months, at only every 6 weeks. In this one, this will be unique today, in the sense that I'm going to very much couch the cultivation of cognitive intelligence in the 21st century. So there's going to be a lot of references to the world that we're living in right now, and the state of the world right now, but then going from there and going back to classical sources in the Pali Canon, back to Shantideva. And so that's going to be the agenda for today. And the title of this talk is Believers, Contemplatives, and the Future of Humanity, or Human Civilization, the future of human civilization. So I hope this is of interest to everyone, because we are all believers. Some of us are contemplatives, and I think we all care about the future of human civilization, which, as we know, is deeply imperiled right now because of what humanity has done to the environment, particularly over the last 150 years, and a crescendo over the last 50 years, 70 years or so. So that's what we'll be attending to today. And I have 6 weeks to prepare for these lectures. And then this morning I was up at 3:20 or so, no, a little bit later. But my mind was bubbling and bubbling and bubbling like a hive of honeybees, swarming and swarming and swarming. And so I wrote a whole set of new notes today, this morning. And I think as this hive of honeybees swirled around in my mind, I think they came up with a lot of honey and a lot of stingers. So we shall see. I must say I enormously enjoyed preparing this talk, and I hope you will as well and find it meaningful. But let's begin in this traditional context with motivation, cognitive intelligence from the beginning. So let's just pause for a moment, arouse the most meaningful motivation we can for this time together, those of us here in the chapel here at Myo Samden Ling, and those who are listening by way of the internet. So let's cultivate bodhicitta, the most sublime of all motivations, the pinnacle of cognitive intelligence. Let's do so silently. Wallace. So, on the one hand, as I just mentioned, this will be the third in a very meaningful sequence of talks on these 6 modes of intelligence. But also, very gratefully, I had the opportunity about a week ago to listen to a talk by Khandro Kunga Bhuma Rinpoche. Those of us know her personally, Khandro. And it was on, she called it a conversation on material and Buddhist science. And I have to say, I found it absolutely scintillating. It was 2 hours long and scintillating in terms of the sharpness of her insights. First of all, looking back on a number of meetings with His Holiness and various scientists over the last maybe even 20 years or so taking place in Dharamsala. And she referred to this with a lot of this whole series with a lot of appreciation, but also some very critical comments designed to be helpful, to be constructive, of things that had not been done, that could be done, things that were done that were not optimal. But her criticism was so utterly gracious, warm and compassionate and respectful. And also what was utterly outstanding in this talk of hers was that it was punctuated so frequently with sheer joyous laughter. Any of you who know Khandro, you know how it just bubbles up spontaneously. And I know this is coming from a very deep source. When she says when you cultivate insight sufficiently, you can look even at suffering and experience bliss. And as I listened to her, watched her, listened to her voice, the sound of her laughter, in this absolutely marvelous 2-hour presentation with just a handful of Western disciples, all of them American, in the room with her at her home in Kathmandu. I was just so deeply moved by the joy that she brought to this topic. And it really did seem unconditional, coming from a very deep source. And I think a very reasonable explanation for that. She's dwelling in Rigpa. She's dwelling in Rigpa. And all her words are flowing spontaneously out of that. I don't think you have to have much in the way of pure vision to see that is simply true. So the talk I'm giving now is, one could say, also a response to the talk she gave. I know in academia, where I lived for some years, there's often a presentation and then a respondent, right? One or more. She gave the glorious presentation, which to my mind is really kind of a vision of what we are doing and what we can be doing here in our network of Centers for Contemplative Research. She gave us our marching orders, absolutely in tune with the vision of His Holiness, who has already given us a mission statement for our center in Italy and the one here as well. So I'm a respondent, just then sharing from my own background thoughts that I think might be useful in response to her magnificent vision, which I absolutely take to heart. So on that note then, we turn to my first set of notes that I thought were complete, and then another 2.5 pages bubble up this morning. What to do? And if I can go through all my notes, then you'll see there's a format here that's classic in Tibetan scholarly tradition. It's called Ga Sha Pong Sum. Ga is you refute that which you see needs refuting. It's wrong, it's harmful, it's detrimental. Refute it, like applying a medicine to some disease. And then Sha is giving your own presentation. Well, what do you have to say? What do you have to say? That's Sha. And so we have first refutation, and then a presentation. Ga Sha Pong Sum. Pong means to reject. And this is a rebuttal of potential objections, arguments against your major thesis, the presentation. And now I'm letting Shantideva do the heavy work, the heavy lifting for the third part. So now we go right into it. What is it that I would like to refute? Well, there's a motto that I think is very, very common, familiar to your ears, I'm sure. And one could say it's a motto of scientific materialism. And I've heard this just recently, but I've been hearing it for years. I'm not a believer, I'm a scientist. Ever heard that before? And when I say I'm a scientist and I'm not a believer, I'm skeptical of those believers. Because we scientists, or we people who are following science, we're dealing with facts, with reality. Believers, they believe all kinds of stuff. A lot of it's rubbish. I'm not a believer. I'm a scientist. that has about as many holes in it as Swiss cheese. But it also has a kernel of truth, historically, a big kernel of truth. Go back to Copernicus and then Galileo. Copernicus with his wild-eyed mathematical theorem of the sun being in the center, the heliocentric system, and it ruffled a lot of feathers. He had no evidence to support his theory. It was a mathematical theory. But it definitely went against the grain and aroused the ire of a lot of people who took, theologians especially, scholastics especially, that took every word in the Bible as being literally true. It's God's word. He didn't mince words. He said what he meant what he said, and he didn't say that the earth and the planet go around the sun. He said, no, the sun goes around the earth. In fact, he even had the ability to stop it. When Joshua, the prophet, was waging war against the Canaanites, it was getting dark and he wanted to continue with battling, so he called on God and said, God, please make the sun and the moon stop right in their tracks because I want to continue the war into the nighttime. God did it. Well, how can you do that if the sun isn't even going around the earth? But God complied, and then he was able to fight on. And so that ruffled a lot of feathers. Galileo ruffled a lot of feathers, not only with that discovery, because he came up with incontrovertible empirical evidence that the Ptolemaic system that had dominated European thought for 1400 years was wrong. And that means the Greek scholastics like Aristotle were wrong. The Bible was not literally true. And so this was empirical fact, though. It was brilliant mathematics, and then Galileo's empirical evidence that it can't possibly be true, the other one. Those are facts. You can agree with them or not agree with them, but they are just true. And so Galileo had the facts. He was a scientist, many regarded it as the father of modern science, and he was refuting with evidence the beliefs of a literal interpretation or reading of the Bible. Well, that got him into trouble. He was put under house arrest. He also ridiculed the Pope, which was not a good idea. And the Pope said, go to your room and stay there. And that was his punishment. Move ahead into the 1830s, we had great discoveries made about the age of the planet. And they were pushing the planet back to millions of years old, contrary to roughly 8,000 years old, according to a literal reading of the Old Testament. That ruffled feathers, 1830s. But the real knockout punch, boom, 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 was, of course, Darwin, above all, and his co-conspirator, Alfred Russel Wallace, who did simultaneous research coming to the same conclusion independently. And of course, that is that species are not static, and that we have evolved, and we've evolved from more primitive primates. Now, there's a lot of fact in that. That theory, independently formulated by these two brilliant biologists, was based on observation, on fact. But that ran against the grain of, again, a literal reading of the Bible, a book of Genesis and so forth, of all of the species piling onto Noah's Ark. It doesn't fit it well. But Darwin was dealing with fact, and the people who were challenging him were dealing clearly with belief. They had no facts at their disposal at all, except for what the Bible says. It was a breaking point there in the mid-19th century, with biologist Thomas Huxley serving as Darwin's bulldog, saying, enough, basta already. We've been struggling against the church, the literal reading of the Bible, for 200 years now, and enough. Prior to Galileo, during the time of Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and right into the mid-19th century, virtually all scientists, for Copernicus onward, were all devout Christians. Many of them were churchmen. Copernicus was, Kepler was a theologian, Newton wrote theology extensively, Galileo was trained in a monastery, contemplative monastery as a youth. So the scientific facts themselves did not present you with a worldview. They give you a lot of facts. But the fact that the Earth orbits around the sun is not a worldview. The fact that the Earth is older than thought is not a worldview. The fact that we evolved from more primitive primates is not a worldview. They're a bunch of facts. But for these first 200 years or so, from Copernicus on to Darwin, all of science, all of scientific research and writing and pondering formulating theories and so forth, was all couched within a worldview, and it was the worldview of, above all, Christianity, rooted in the Bible, right? Including, what's the nature of human nature? You're created in the image of God. That's who you are. So rejoice, celebrate. You're created in the image of God. That's got to be a good thing. Worldview. And this is God's creation. It's a worldview. And also, of course, there's a set of values incorporated into the Christian worldview. And the values is, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. That's a value. Strive for ethical perfection. That's a value. Great thinkers like St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas wrote elaborately about eudaimonia, genuine well-being, truth-given joy. Now this is value. This is value. What is the meaning of life? What is we're striving for? As Augustine said, all we really need is to know how to be happy. But he's not talking about how many yachts you have, or the snazzy kind of car you have, or your trophy wife and so forth. The meaning of life is the eudaimonia, a truth-given joy. That's value. And then a way of life. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's a good starter. Jesus has an enormous amount to say about way of life. So all of these scientific facts, whether or not they corresponded to a literal reading of the Bible, they were all couched within Christian worldview, Christian values, Christian way of life, as embodied and taught by Jesus Christ. So the scientists found a meaning in their scientific explorations because of the worldview in which it was couched. As Galileo said, I'm seeking to know the mind of God, the mind of the Creator, by way of the creation. It was a theological pursuit for him as a devout Christian. All right, so then we see in that battle that went on until the time of Darwin, that struggle, that tension. It was to a large extent people dealing with fact who were countering belief that was simply based on authority. And time again, the belief had to give way. Or the religious people recoiled into religious fundamentalism and simply turned their back on facts. And that's happening to this day. But with Darwin, with Huxley, Thomas Huxley, they kind of had it. Darwin gave up on Christianity. He felt God just wasn't answering his prayers. He could not believe in a benevolent personal God who responded to prayer. He had empirical evidence to the contrary, as far as he was concerned. He prayed to God with deep belief. God didn't fulfill his prayers. Thomas Huxley also gave up on Christianity, gave up on religion altogether. But they didn't stop science. That didn't stop science. But Thomas Huxley, above all, this brilliant biologist, he, seeing the vacuum left by the abandonment of the Christian worldview, values and way of life, he introduced a substitute. He formulated it. He's like the father of scientific materialism. And that became the worldview for many, but not all, scientists ever since then. And to an increasing degree, scientific materialism, in which not God, but matter is the ground of being, the fundamental reality. All of reality consists of matter and configurations of matter, epiphenomena of matter, emergent qualities of matter. Matter is primary. They took out God, put in matter. So with that worldview, where we are animals, actually, of course, according to Darwin, animals. And if animals don't have immortal souls, then why should we? We're just one more type of primate with a bigger frontal cortex. So there's a worldview there. There's a view of who we are. We're naked apes, is what we are, in the words of Desmond Morris, I think his name was. What is the value in a worldview where everything is reduced to matter? And we'll see repercussions for human identity. Well, it's hedonism. What is of value? The pursuit of happiness. Now, by hedonism, I don't mean something vulgar, drinking and whining and boozing and so forth. I mean just the pursuit of happiness that you find by looking outside, by success, by acquiring wealth, by acquiring power, influence, by acquiring, pursuing and getting status, fame, respect of others, by the pursuit of sensual pleasures. And that's it. Look outside yourself for happiness, because there's nothing inside that will give you happiness. You're not created in the image of God, you're created in the image of a naked ape. Or brain imaging, you want to know what you look like? Look at a brain imaging. That'll tell you who are you. You are brain. And so there's another set of values that's come in, another worldview that's come in, another set of values that come in, a way of life. It's consumerism. Consumerism, happiness is to be found by ever-increasing gross national product, by pursuing wealth, spending wealth, and getting as much from the environment as you possibly can. Now that's a worldview. With a worldview, values, and a way of life, and it's supplanted to a large extent, to an increasing and growing degree, the very meaningful worldview, values, and way of life of Christianity. But this presents us with a meaningless and mindless universe. And you can see if you can live with that. And so, I'm not a believer, I'm a scientist. That's the origin of this. And there's still, and many scientists, or followers of science, scientific materialism, are still saying, look at those stupid religious fundamentalists. It's all belief and no substance. Whereas we scientists look, cutting edge, more and more knowledge. And so there we are. So they're picking up on the legacy of the past. But is it true that scientists are not believers? It's only religious people are believers. Believers and non-believers. We've heard that one. Even some lamas use that distinction. So I want to refer briefly now to four dimensions that I discuss at quite some length in the first chapter of my book, Taboo of Subjectivity. It's the 4 dimensions of the scientific tradition. And when the link for this talk is sent out, that chapter, which I have permission from Oxford University Press to share publicly, explains in detail what I will right now explain very, very succinctly. Challenging again, I'm not a believer, I'm a scientist. 4 dimensions, which are often conflated into one thing by believers within the tradition, the scientific tradition. The first dimension is natural science itself. Physics, chemistry, biology, astronomy, cosmology, medical science, and so forth. It's natural science. Science means knowledge, etymologically, and it's knowledge of the natural world. And we know this has been a terrific and a monumental success story from the time of Galileo, with his introduction of the appropriate technology for studying the stars and planets, and then right on for the development of astronomy, of physics, chemistry, biology, and so forth. A tremendous, tremendous storehouse of knowledge that is consensual knowledge based on empirical evidence that is compelling to anybody intelligent enough to understand it. It's a great body of knowledge, and it's growing. Textbooks are written for high school students, college students, and so forth. This is your intro biology text. This is your chemistry textbook. This is your physics textbook. And it's filled with consensual knowledge that is fact-based. And whether you're Chinese, whether you're Buddhist, whether you're Hindu, whether you're Muslim, whether you're an atheist, facts are facts. And they've come up with an enormous body of consensually validated scientific facts that have enriched our lives in myriad ways. This is the first comment that Khandro made, that, boy, we are really the beneficiaries of so much progress in science. You know, the fact that we can have this talk right now with the video and dissemination by the internet, transportation, communication, increased food production, medicine, and the list, and then creature comforts, material comforts, entertainment. It's sometimes said that we learn more in the 20th century than in all the centuries that preceded it. So this is a fantastic success story of consensual knowledge. Those are facts. But now it's often thought that science is completely unitary. It's one thing. It's science, as if there's one entity, science. But those who have looked into this in great detail, including one of my professors at Stanford, Peter Gallison, one PhD in physics, another one in philosophy, he led a graduate seminar in physics, philosophy of physics, the best course I took at Stanford. It was brilliant. And he co-edited a book called The Disunity of Science. Before I go there, I think I'd like to just step for a moment, retract a little bit. So it is quite right and just to laud the tremendous successes and benefits for our hedonic well-being, our material well-being, for our health, physical health, for which, from science, for which we are the beneficiaries. But we all know that is not all there is to be said about science. It's not only produced medicines and transportation, education, but weapons of mass destruction. Physical, like nuclear weaponry, chemical warfare, biological warfare. So the brilliance of these scientists who are willing to sell like mercenaries, sell their skills for the development and proliferation, the scientists and technologists, engineers, for the development and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is also one of the outcomes of this development of science as the knowledge or wisdom and technology as the skillful means, hand in hand. Technology without science is in bondage, and science without technology is in bondage. But put the two together, wow. Everything, Galileo started it, finding the appropriate technology for studying the stars, planets, sun, and moon. Telescope. But the weapons of mass destruction that are in the hands of people who right now who are morally irresponsible, and it's just waiting for one of them to throw a tantrum. And just one tactical nuclear warhead, just one, which would be countered by just one, would be countered by 2 and 4 and 6 and 8, and bye-bye human civilization. But even if that doesn't happen, and whether it does or not, who knows? But in the past, we've never had a weapon we haven't used. In the history of humanity, we have a weapon, sooner or later we use it. That's true. But the other one that is so painfully obvious is global climate change. And the way that, especially since the Industrial Revolution in England, the rise of capitalism, of communism, scientific materialism, all simultaneously, we see that we are absolutely disrupting the balance of the ecosphere, wiping out wildlife, the greatest destruction of wildlife since the asteroid hit Russia 65 million years ago. This is the biggest one since then. But that was just one hit. It was catastrophic, but it was one asteroid. Whereas we are now, every day, hitting the world with destruction, wiping out species, throwing the whole balance of the ecosphere into disruption. And the irony here is, I think, there's no doubt among people who really study this issue, we right now have all the technology we need to avert the problem, to stop that disruption. We're not using it. Now, how can this be that we, this magnificently intelligent species, are destroying the only home we have, and we have the means of technology to stop doing it, and we're not doing it? How did this start? That would use science and technology, which are amoral, both are devoid of morality. There's no morality built in. Morality is built into Christianity, the worldview, not into scientific materialism. There's no morality there at all. Nada. Well, this has interesting roots. And I want to tell you a story. I read it just today. We have this one. So, you ready for a story? I love stories myself. In August of 1619, a retreating Habsburg army camped in Ulm, a small city in the south of Germany. And among this group of several thousand troops was a young fellow named René Descartes, a soldier of fortune. There was nothing special about him up to this point, but on the night of August 12th of that year, he went to sleep and had 3 subsequent dreams in which an angel appeared to him and said, see, you know Descartes, the mathematician, the philosopher, the scientist, probably didn't know that he was a prophet. An angel appeared to him and said, conquest of nature is to be achieved through number and measure. Conquest of nature, who had ever coined that term before, except for this angel? He thought it was an angel. I'm not so sure. But conquest of nature, what a bizarre notion. Conquest of what, the ocean or a mountain or a forest? But that's the word used. Conquest of nature is to be achieved quantitatively, number and measure. Well, one of the great framers of natural philosophy, of science, a contemporary of Descartes and of Galileo, was Sir Francis Bacon, lived in the 16th, 17th century, regarded as many as the father of modern philosophy. And in his renowned and extremely influential text, Novum Organum, he explains how man can come to know and conquer nature. So from conquest to conquer. And he writes here, man's empire lay at his feet. It is nature that needs man, and it's always male gender, you see, emphatically, needs man to tame it, conquer it, and subdue it. I don't think there's ever been a culture on the planet that had that agenda. The Native Americans? Come on. The subjugation of nature occurs through industry and man's pursuit of knowledge. Subjecting the world to torment is what is necessary for us to know it and the benefit from it. Industry, technology, and wealth are utilized to conquer nature, to study nature, and to torment nature, as in deforestation, animal experimentation, and so forth. Through this conquest and torment of nature, our wealth and comfort is found. As such, man creates a more artificial environment and becomes himself an instrument of artificiality. One of the great framers of the whole vision of modern science, before scientific materialism ever came along, he's writing in the 17th century. But it's startling. It's startling, isn't it? Conquering nature, tormenting, putting nature on the rack and torturing her. She's her. Man over here, she's over there. And ripping from her the facts of nature so that we can subjugate her. And this is a devout Christian saying this. So we come back to science. Science is often regarded as a body of integrated, coherent, unified facts, the scientific worldview. But science, the scientific facts, are not a worldview. They're always couched in some worldview or another. There's a Christian worldview, there's the worldview of scientific materialism, there's a Buddhist worldview with a view, values, and way of life. But we often think of it as being one entity, one unified entity, the unity of science, that all the branches of science all fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, and they all form one unified, internally coherent and consistent whole. This has been challenged by some of the most thoughtful individuals anywhere. Number one, in this new worldview, of scientific worldview, does God fit in at all? Well, many of the believers saying, I am a scientist, not a believer, would say, heck no. We got rid of that superstition, first with the Enlightenment in the 18th century, and then scientific materialism in the 18th century, and then the 19th century. But interestingly enough, a poll published in Scientific American in 1914 showed that 40% of scientists in America stated they believed in God. So for all the rise of scientific materialism, almost half of scientists still stuck to their guns and said, I believe in God. A poll with the same set of questions was again conducted in 1997. So now, during the 20th century, massive rise, domination by scientific materialism. Another poll was done now in 1997, also reported in Scientific American, and it indicated that 40% of scientists still believe in God. So many of the scientists, almost half, are sticking with their guns. So there's no one view, either materialist or non-materialist, that can be said to represent the scientific community as a whole. But now, what is the nature of physical reality? In Buddhism, as many of you know, when we're in the Mahamudra and Dzogchen context especially, if you're seeking to understand the actual nature of the mind, then you explore what are its origins. From what did the mind really emerge? Where is it located? Really? What happens to the mind? Really? Jung Ne Do Sum, origin, location, destination. Right? And that's a really core to ontological vipassana, understanding the actual nature of the mind. Well, what about the actual nature of the physical world? The actual nature. In his recent book entitled Quantum, science writer Manjit Kumar cites a poll about the interpretation of quantum mechanics taken among physicists at a conference in 1999. Now, it's widely acknowledged by physicists generally that among all the branches of physics, and quite possibly among all the branches of science, quantum physics is the most successful, fantastically successful. And with the technology coming out of quantum mechanics, fantastically successful. But what does it mean? Because the founders of quantum mechanics, Niels Bohr, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, and so forth, they said, what's happening here is making the ground tremble beneath our feet. It's shocking, shocking, jaw-dropping, the implications of quantum mechanics. The world will never be the same. This is the second revolution in physics. The old view of the 19th century classical physics is shot. It's shot. It will never come up again. Absolute space, absolute time, absolute matter, and so forth. It's a new world. But what does it mean? And so this poll was taken in 1999. And of the 90 respondents, only 4 said they accepted the standard interpretation of quantum mechanics taught in every undergraduate physics course in the world. Only 4% agreed with what high school kids and college kids say is gospel truth. Only 4% of the physicists actually believe what they're teaching their teenagers and young people. 30% favored the many worlds interpretation formulated by Princeton theoretician Hugh Everett III. 30%, I find this amazing. This is the multiple worlds, many worlds interpretation, where there's a whole bunch of duplicates of you all over the world in multiple universes. And there's a Carmen in that one, maybe multiple Carmens over there, and Eva's over there, and it's just proliferating, creating multiple worlds. It's completely cuckoo. It's a mathematical curiosity with absolutely no empirical evidence behind it, none. And it can never be tested. You'll never be able to do even a measurement and find, oh, there's the Alan Wallace in that other world. It has no empirical basis, and it can never be tested. And 30% of quantum physicists say, count me in. I think they've been watching a lot of science fiction movies, because they're very popular in science fiction movies. But this means that they're out in La La Land. They were scientists, and now they're 100% believers with no empirical evidence and no way to test the theory. And 1 out of 3 thinks, count me in, that sounds good to me. Pass the whiskey. Or something smaller, stronger. I mean, this is crazy. 30%. And then 50% among the different interpretations say none of the above or undecided. I don't know. 50% of physicists. And so in other words, the real implications of quantum mechanics, what does that tell us about the nature of the world, seems to be hidden in a cloud of uncertainty. So much for the unity of science. When you get to quantum physics, which has the deepest insight into the fundamental constituents of the physical world, atoms, elementary particles, energy, matter, there's no agreement at all. None. So where's the unity of science now? That's science. It's fact. But so much belief and so much disunity, and with an agenda going back to Descartes and Francis Bacon, that should make it no surprise that with that seed, it's now giving rise to the harvest of the wanton destruction of our environment. Such that if we continue on the current course, and there's no sign that we're letting up, there will be no human civilization as we understand it by the end of the century. It'll be a different world, and it won't be a nicer one. And we will have wiped out much of the wildlife, most of the wildlife. We already have. But that destruction of natural habitat and species continues now unabated. While over the last few years of the Biden administration, America's burned more coal than ever before. And we're one of the good guys, right? Leaders of the free world. So that's science. But I know enough about science, been trained enough in science, as a physics student at Amherst, that in science, scientists know something. It's not belief, they know something. Through years of training study, research, and they know a lot of things. But in physics alone, my mentor at Amherst, his best specialty was quantum optics. That he knew. Relativity theory, he believed. And the other many branches of physics, he hadn't done the research. One person can't do research in all these multiple fields of physics, let alone all the other branches of science. So you know your own specialization. But for all the other branches, even within physics, let alone biology, chemistry, it's belief. It's about 99% belief of the scientists believing as they read the articles in Science, Nature, Scientific American, and so forth. Hardly ever does it touch on their own specialization, in which they say, oh yeah, I know that's true. No, hardly ever. 99% of the time, they're believing things that they don't know for themselves, but they're believing on the authority of other scientists and the peer-reviewed journals. A scientist without belief is no scientist at all. It's a chimpanzee. You can't conduct science without trusting, having belief in, trust and confidence in your peers and your predecessors and the people making the technology. So the notion that I'm not a believer, I'm a scientist, is complete rubbish. It's just they believe different things. They're skeptics, but everybody's a skeptic of others' beliefs. There's nothing new about that. And so then we move, maybe a little bit more quickly, to the second dimension, and that's metaphysical realism. Now, virtually all scientists, from Copernicus right up to the early 20th century with the advent of quantum physics, virtually all scientists, specifically all physicists, they're all metaphysical realists, virtually without exception. Up to the time of Darwin, they were metaphysical realists because God created the universe before we were here. We came on the sixth day. But before then, he created everything else. We were the cherry on the cake. But God created it, it's already out there, and there is a correct view of it, and it's God's own view. The God's eye view of the universe he created. And that's metaphysical realism. That says there's a universe, a physical universe out there, freestanding, independent of any of our measurements, our observations, our conceptual frameworks, independent of language. And the role of science, the ideal of science, is to represent what's already out there. Earlier seen as from a God's eye view, nowadays, in the words of Thomas Nagel, the philosopher, a view from nowhere. That is what's really out there when no one's looking. And science's ideal is to represent completely a representation of what's already out there. So there's reality, there's the map, bingo, you nailed it, good, you're now finished with science. In other words, an inherently existent physical world out there that can be accurately represented completely in one and only one way. Now, almost all scientists believe that, with or without believing God, until quantum mechanics came along and cast that deeply into question. Deeply into question. The whole role of measurement, the role of the observer, it's not been solved. The problem, the measurement problem, was formulated a century ago by people like Heisenberg and so forth. There's been no progress really in solving it. What's the role of measurement? Before you perform a measurement, all you have is a probability function, a probability field, a range of possibilities. You make the measurement, and now that concretizes into there's an electron there, there's a photon there. But prior to measurement, you cannot say because it's indeterminate. So not all scientists by any means today, not even all quantum physicists, believe in metaphysical realism. Some do, and many don't. But there's no agreement on just, is there a world out there or not, and can we represent it or not? There's no agreement on metaphysical realism. Now, I've quoted one of the premier theoretical physicists in the whole world, Nima Kati Ahmed at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. I'll quote him one more time, because the insight that he brought to this conference with 300 physicists in the auditorium at Cornell University is staggering. And I'll just read it quickly. This is in 2010 on a conference on the future of fundamental physics. And he stated many, many separate arguments, all very strong individually, suggest that the very notion of space-time is not a fundamental one. Space-time is doomed. There is no such thing as space-time. fundamentally in the actual underlying description of the laws of physics. That's very startling, because what physics is supposed to be about is describing things as they happen in space and time. So if there is no space-time, it's not clear what physics is about. It's become now a branch of psychology. If there's no space-time out there inherently existent, then what is physics about? That's why he says, that's why this is a hard problem, and that's a serious comment. And I watched this in a video, and nobody in the audience laughed. This is one of the premier physicists in the whole world. And the director of his institute, Robert de Graaf, it's a Dutch name, the director of the Institute for Advanced Study, he says, what we are learning these days that we might have to give up that what Einstein holds sacred, namely space and time. So if we give up space and time, then what do we have left? And then he cites his theory, the holographic universe, saying what's happening in space in some sense is all described in terms of a screen out here. The ultimate description of reality resides on this screen, and this is like a movie projector that creates an illusion of the three-dimensional reality that I'm now experiencing. If it's just all a projection, where there isn't any space or time, the question that needs an answer is, what's the projector? And of course, even to this day, hardly any physicists are taking consciousness seriously. So he skips right over it and tries to come up with another, what's the projector? Projecting into the emptiness of space and time. Do all physicists agree with him? No, but these are two of the top people in the whole world. They cannot be dismissed lightly if you're a physicist. How about philosophy? Because philosophy, natural philosophy, go hand in hand. According to a survey done by the philosopher David Chalmers, who does not accept the notion that consciousness is just epiphenomenon of matter, according to a survey he did, 11% of contemporary philosophers are non-materialists. They don't believe in scientific materialism. They don't reduce everything to matter. So they represent a significant minority. But more important, this is a real clincher, but more important is his finding that there was nothing of importance the philosophical community at large agrees upon. So when it comes to the mind-body problem, there's no consensus. So the scientists are in disarray about what's out there. The philosophers don't agree on anything. They make their reputations and get tenure by disagreeing with somebody else. Nobody gets tenure by, I'm with him. Nobody. Well, then be his poodle, you know. But if you want a PhD and you want tenure, be original. And that means you have to disagree with somebody and take your stand. That means they all disagree with each other. Whoops. So metaphysical realism, yeah, that's a philosophy. But many philosophers of science don't buy it. Hilary Putnam's one, Bas van Fraas is another, and there are many others. They don't buy it. The evidence is not there to support it. And some would even say, if there were a universe out there independent of all measurement, we'd have no way of measuring it. It would be inherently existent and therefore not interact. That's the philosophy. Moving on quickly, what I'm so good at. That was the time for a chuckle. I should have a little laugh. Moving on to the next one, which is very, very important in this fourfold dimension, scientific materialism. Now, where religion was, scientific materialism moved in. With its worldview, its values, its way of life, materialism, hedonism, consumerism, it moved in. And I've argued in my paper here, published in the book from Oxford University Press, it's an ersatz religion. People who are scientific materialists adhere to this with all the tenacity, often the blind faith, of religious believers. It's exactly the same. It's where religion was, scientific materialism moved in. And it has its church. Thomas Huxley, the formulator of scientific materialism, that wedded it with science back in the mid-19th century, he actually conceived of a church scientific, for which their theology, or materiology, would be scientific materialism. And he proudly raised this banner of the church scientific and said, our aspiration, we scientists, is to achieve intellectual dominion over the entire world, that the church scientific will supplant all other religions. And I'm a true believer. He got a lot of converts. He himself got really cold feet on it in his later life because he thought that science has no ethics. Christianity does, science doesn't. But the true believers carried on without him. And that's an ersatz religion. So that's the third dimension. It's not facts. The beliefs of scientific materialism are not facts. They are beliefs, period. But unlike religion, where there's faith in God or Moses or Jesus or Zhuangzi or Buddha, faith in somebody who presumably knows what's going on, in scientific materialism, it's faith in nobody in particular. Because nobody knows that that's true, that everything boils down to matter and derivatives of matter. Nobody knows. It's just in the wind. And then finally, and I can wrap it up, the four dimensions, is scientism. Scientism is the extreme fundamentalist version of scientific materialism. Advocates of scientism say not only does everything boil down to matter and its emergent properties, science is the only way. There is no other mode of knowledge that matters or counts or is legitimate. Science is the only way. Scientific knowledge is the only knowledge. The only explanations are physicalist explanations. If it's not a physical explanation, it's not an explanation at all. And the methods of science are the only ones that work. And everything else is rubbish. And so this is the counterpart of religious fundamentalism. And religious fundamentalism is dangerous. It always has been. It's grasping onto one's own view and one's own methods as the only ones that count, the only ones that are legitimate. And so if somebody disagrees with you, they are wrong. And they have to be subjugated, at best ignored, or annihilated. And this is the root of religious wars, ever since there's been religion. The religious fundamentalism is we are the chosen people. We have the only creed. We have the only God. We have the only doctrine. Ours is right. Everybody's wrong. Else is wrong. And in Buddhism, this is called one of the 6 fundamental mental afflictions of grasping onto one's own view as supreme, the delusion of grasping, and whether it's Dzogchen or whether it's Theravada or whether it's Baptist theology, grasping onto one's own view as supreme, one's own methods as supreme, is delusional and it's dangerous. And the religious wars throughout history have proven how dangerous it is, and it didn't stop when nations such as the Soviet Union, Communist China, embraced scientism as their worldview, as their ersatz religion, fundamentalist religion. It's these countries, Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, the current Communist China, they spilt more blood in their attacks on religion and religious believers than any religious war in history. They've killed millions, methodically, systematically, genocide. So anybody that thinks that only religious fanatics get into religious warfare, doctrinal warfare, don't be naive. The communists are the most bloodthirsty in all of human history. They've killed more than any other group with their ersatz religion, the scientific materialism, with its fundamentalist mode. And so that was a lot. That was almost an hour. And I covered 3 lines. The historian Daniel Boorstin wrote a big book with a lot of research behind it. And he writes in the preface, the book is The Discoverers, a history of man's search to know his world and himself. So it's a very ambitious book by a very knowledgeable historian. And he writes, the obstacles to discovery, the illusions of knowledge, are also part of our knowledge. Not only discoveries, but illusions of knowledge. Only against the forgotten backdrop of the received common sense and myths of their time can we begin to sense the courage, the rashness, the heroic and imaginative thrusts of the great discoverers. They had to battle against the current facts, in quotation marks, and dogmas of the learned. Historically, the illusions of knowledge have proven to be the greatest impediments to discovery. Not ignorance, but the illusions of knowledge. As Mark Twain said, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble, but what you do know that just ain't so. So the cultivation of cognitive intelligence, a core theme, a core element of that cultivation is to distinguish between belief and knowledge. Belief is easy. Knowledge is often very difficult to acquire. But belief is a snap of the finger. And this obstructs us as a civilization. It obstructs us individually, where we believe we know something. We believe we know something, and we don't. It's merely belief. I'm not a believer, I'm a scientist. If you're a scientist, you're a believer, or else you're brain dead. We're all believers, at least most of us. So the cultivation of cognitive intelligence entails dispelling the confusion, the conflation of belief and knowledge. Get your scalpel out and separate. This is belief, this is knowledge. But don't conflate the two. They're not the same. Between rumination and intuition, I often call my students, you have a question, pose it to your intuition. Some of my students say, yeah, yippee-ki-yo, and they ride the horse of rumination and come up with all kinds of kooky ideas. My intuition tells me, I'm sorry, that's not intuition. That's rumination. That's your dualistic, confused, mentally afflicted mind coming up with a bunch of rubbish. And you call it, my intuition tells me. Think again. The conflation of conditioned consciousness with primordial consciousness. You might recall the Buddha himself saying, rely not on conditioned consciousness, rely on primordial consciousness. Buddha himself saying that. And then finally, in a similar vein in Dzogchen, we find, draw a sharp distinction between the mind of a sentient being and pristine awareness. In that marvelous passage in the Vajra Essence, one distinction after another, that's all cultivation of cognitive intelligence. Don't conflate this. If you do, you'll never achieve enlightenment. Don't conflate this, don't conflate this, don't conflate this, one after another. When Rinpoche, Gyatso Rinpoche taught this, he said, this section of the book, this could be a book all by itself. It's classic. So here we are, sentient beings. Sentient beings in the midst of 2 trillion galaxies. I keep on coming back to that mind-boggling number, 2 trillion galaxies. And all of us, from the Buddhist perspective, and I intuitively feel it must be true. Let me silence this. Thank you. All sentient beings are wishing to be free of suffering and wishing to find happiness. If you don't, you're not sentient. That's what sentient means. You can be a conscious being, theoretically. You can be conscious and not sentient. Sentient means you have feelings. You don't like suffering, you like happiness or pleasure. And all of us, from those primitive multicellular organism up to animals, to human beings, to devas, asuras, hell beings, pretas, and so forth, all sentient beings wish to be free of suffering, every single moment. We're not always actively in the pursuit of happiness, because sometimes we feel it's hopeless. But if we're in pain, mentally or physically, we always want to be free. And as intelligent human beings, with exceptional intelligence, this great big frontal cortex supports that. If you want the fruit, what are the causes? If you don't identify the causes of happiness, what makes you think you'll ever find the result? Now, if it's hedonic, you're hungry and you find some fruit, okay, I just found the solution. That's easy. You want to have sex, you have sex, okay, you found the solution. So forth. But mental suffering. What are the causes of mental suffering? Between mental and physical, I think most of us, if we really give it some thought, would say, if I had to have physical suffering or mental suffering, but I can only be free of one, I think we'd say, I want to be free of mental suffering. Because I'm free of mental suffering, I can bear the physical. Between the two, we actually prioritize the mental. It's closer to home. So physical suffering, go to a doctor, or an acupuncturist, or a physiotherapist. Not a problem, that's their bailiwick. Mental suffering, you want to be free of it. The whole range of mental suffering. Depression, anxiety, grief, paranoia, PTSD, and so forth. What are the causes of mental suffering? A few statistics that were brought to my attention by a very dear friend regarding the causes of happiness. In the United States, since 1950, the gross domestic product has increased 50 times. Massive. 50 times greater. Whereas increase in well-being has been 0. Rates of depression, in the meantime, since 1950 in the United States have decreased 10 times. And it's the number one cause of disability worldwide. Depression, not cancer or heart disease. No, depression is the number one cause of disability worldwide, with the risk of depression 32% higher in wealthy countries. And to slip over to ADHD, in the United States, 20% of high school age boys have been diagnosed with ADHD. So here in the United States, I'll just speak here because that's where I happen to be. If I speak in Italy, I'd probably speak more about Europe. But here in the United States, we have an education system. And it's a model for many education systems around the world. The British-American model. You find it in India, you find it in communist China, in Singapore, South America. How are we educating our youth, our children, our adolescents, young adults in college? What are we teaching them? Are we teaching them how to find happiness, or simply how to make a living, or to succeed? Succeed as in material success, succeed as in gaining influence and power, succeed as in gaining reputation, status, notoriety, fame. What are we teaching our children? What's education for? And the evidence shows that we're not teaching them how to cultivate happiness. If we are, we're failing abysmally. Depression's on the rise. For all of the noble efforts of psychotherapists, psychiatrists, and so forth, the increase of numbers of mental health care workers has probably gone also up exponentially over the last 70 years. But mental ill health has also gone up. Depression up 10 times, ADHD, anxiety, and so forth and so on. And so this doesn't bode well for our mental health care system in the United States, and it's very similar in Europe, in Asia, South America, Australia, and so on. But the whole pursuit of wealth, how many children nowadays are being educated by their parents and the school system to think, you want to be happy? Succeed. That's what you're getting an education for, stupid. Get an education, succeed. What does succeed means? Financially affluent. And if you want financially, then become more affluent. You'll be happier. Be really, really wealthy, like a Bill Gates or the others. People who, the 8 wealthiest people in the world owning as much as the poor 4 billion people on the planet. Be like them. Now that's a success story. And okay, I want to succeed. I'll do well, I'll get good grades because I want to succeed. Not just to get by, not to have enough, but no, I want to be rich. Tim Kasser he's a psychologist, wrote a remarkable book called The High Price of Materialism, and he writes, existing scientific research on the value of materialism yields clear and consistent findings. People who are highly focused on materialistic values, lower personal well-being, and have lower personal well-being and psychological health than those who believe that materialistic pursuits are relatively unimportant. These relationships have been documented in samples of people ranging from the wealthy to the poor, from teenagers to the elderly, from Australians to South Koreans. So the gist of his research there, is an outstanding book, is if you're impoverished and you get enough, you can pay your bills, take care of your family, that corresponds to greater happiness. But once you have enough, if you have 10 times as much as you need, 100, 1,000, 10,000, or you have $100 billion that belongs all to you, there's no corresponding increase whatsoever in happiness. There's no correlation. You will not be happier if you're really, really wealthy. You just have more wealth. That should be taught to every kindergarten student in the world, because it's not a religious issue, it's not a philosophical speculation, it's a scientific fact. How many kids are taught that? And if that's true for the acquisition of great wealth, how about acquisition of great power? How about the acquisition of great fame or notoriety? Well, it's got to be the same. I've met very powerful people, prime minister, a queen and so forth, or a princess and so forth. I've met some very famous people. It's perfectly obvious to me they're just not any happier than anybody else. They're just very famous, or they have a lot of authority. And yet, this is what our education system teaches. As His Holiness has commented, modern education is all about looking outside and nothing about looking inside, all about finding hedonic pleasure and nothing about eudaimonic pleasure. So we come back to what are the sources of our discontent? Eric Kandel is one of the most influential thinkers, Nobel laureate in medicine or physiology, is a neuroscientist, professor of biochemistry and biophysics at Columbia, recipient of the year 2000 Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine. And he speaks with a great authority, but he also speaks for a whole community of neuroscientists. He's speaking for the guild. There's nothing heterodox about what he's about to say. It is absolutely what they are taught from the first class you take in neuroscience until you're finishing your postdoc. Here's what he says. You want to know about where your unhappiness comes from, like depression? He says, and now let's look at this as we're all listening, fact or belief? Because he's stating this is uniformly, this is fact. I'm a hotshot neuroscientist, Nobel Prize winner. Listen to me because I'm speaking with authority. I know what I'm talking about. And here's what I'm saying. The brain is a complex biological organ possessing immense computational ability. Fact. Good start. As one neuroscientist, I think he once said, the mind is a computer made of meat. But now he continues, the brain, it constructs our sensory experience. Belief. There's no compelling evidence that the brain is actually constructing our sensory experience. The brain is constructing colors and sounds, smells, joys, dreams, and so forth. There's no evidence whatsoever to support that. That is a derivative of the belief in the primacy of matter. It's not a scientific fact, but he's presenting that as a scientific fact, and that's fraudulent. I'm sorry, but that's fraudulent. But maybe he doesn't know it, then we give him a bit of leniency there. It constructs our sensory experience. No, it doesn't. It regulates our thoughts and emotions. Belief. No, it doesn't. It controls our actions. You don't control your actions. Your intention, your will, your intelligence, they don't control your actions. The brain, which is a biological organ, it controls your action. Now, the brain is like a heart or a liver. It's just more complex. According to people like Khandro, the brain is influenced only by physical influences, nothing beyond that. So it's a lump of fat, protein, electricity, and water that's influenced only by physical influences, drugs, environment, and so forth. There's no morality in the brain. It's any more there's morality in your kidneys. Your brain is an amoral organ. And he's saying it controls your actions. In other words, he just said there is no such thing as morality. It's just whatever you say it is. It's make-believe. If you think a certain ethnic group is worth extermination because they're not pure, that's your morality. He's just wiped out all of morality. And he's also wiped out any sense of moral responsibility. I didn't do it. My brain did it. This is sounding horrendous, frankly. And it's not fact. It's a belief that is purely derivative of the metaphysical, pseudo-theological belief that matter is primary, therefore the brain is primary. It controls our actions. It is responsible not only for relatively simple motor behaviors, like running and eating, but I'm sorry, I choose whether I run or eat. No, he says, no, you don't. Your brain does. But it's also responsible for complex acts that we consider quintessentially human. It's responsible for, like, thinking, speaking, and creating works of art. The brain does all of that, not you. In fact, we're not even sure whether you exist or not, unless you simply are the brain. Looked at from this perspective, our mind is a set of operations carried out by our brain. The mind is what the brain does. All students of neuroscience are taught this as if it's scientific fact. There's no effort to distinguish, and a deliberate effort not to distinguish between the beliefs of scientific materialism and scientific fact. Neuroscience know a lot of facts about the brain, but they will completely mix those together so the students have no idea where one starts and the other one begins. This is indoctrination, it's brainwashing, it's morally reprehensible, and it's catastrophic. And he's saying this with all the authority of a Nobel laureate. I'm aghast. And anybody who believes this, if you're not depressed now, you have not thought about this enough. This is a major source of depression right here. Believing that you are a brain. It's dehumanizing, it's demoralizing, it's disempowering. And all of those are major causes of depression. What do you do in our world where so many people are depressed? What do you do? Who do you look to? What are the causes of your depression? Well, Eric Kandel has already answered the question. It's your brain, stupid. But now Thomas Inzel, who is the former head of the United States National Institute of Mental Health, the longest running, he had the tenure longer than any other director. And it's the largest funder for mental health research in the United States. He recently confessed in 2017, I quote, I spent 13 years at NIMH really pushing on the neuroscience and genetics of mental disorders. He was a true believer. He believed what he was taught. I was really pushing on the neuroscience and genetics of mental disorders. And when I look back on that, I realized that while I think I succeeded at getting lots of really cool papers published by cool scientists at fairly large costs, I think $20 billion, I succeeded at that. I don't think we moved the needle in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalizations, improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness. I hold myself accountable for that. I pissed away $20 billion of the taxpayers' money, and we got nothing for it, except for the neuroscientists got to publish a lot of cool papers that they and only they read. They threw away, may as well burned it. And I confess that. Now this is in 2017. Here we are 7 years later. How do you think the NIMH is allocating their funds today? Exactly the same way. During his tenure, I asked a person on the committee of the NIMH who allocates funds, I said, how much money are you allocating for research in eudaimonia, genuine well-being? How much? What percentage of your budget? 0. How much for looking for the brain correlates of depression, anxiety, and so forth? 20 billion. They could have spent that on helping kids. Instead, all they did was piss it away, based on a delusion of thinking that mental disorders are nothing more than imbalances in the brain. And would want to make you cry your eyes out. That we're still doing it. That we're still doing it. He's just one person. But on the overall efficacy of psychopharmaceutical drugs, the revolution in pharmacology has given doctors more drugs to use, allowing millions of people to reduce their symptoms. Yet the overall impact of this drug revolution on public health has been mixed, and decades of research on the drug's mechanism, on serotonin, for example, the target of antidepressants, drugs like Prozac, has taught scientists nothing about the causes of mental illness. And in a paper published in the JAMA, the Journal of American Medical Association, the benefits of antidepressants are now known to be, quote, non-existent to negligible in patients with mild, moderate, and even severe depression, and high doses of antidepressants are hardly more effective than low ones. In other words, Eric Kandel was flamboyant, catastrophically, and utterly wrong in every non-factual statement he made, every article of faith, every expression of belief. He was wrong on every single one of them, and that's catastrophic. They don't have a clue, and they're not doing research on the actual causes of mental distress. This should be a concern. And yet, are doctors, psychiatrists prescribing any less antidepressants? The business is making billions of dollars for the pharmaceutical industry. They're laughing all the way to the bank. Neuroscientists keep on getting hundreds of millions of dollars to do more of the same. The evidence is incontrovertible. That's not where the origin of mental illness or mental unhappiness is. And they keep on doing the same thing over and over and over again. The facts don't count because their beliefs completely override the facts. And so a colloquial, often quoted definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results, looks to me like the National Institute of Mental Health is an insane organization. I mean, they just filled the definition. It's a colloquial definition. And so when we see how we're treating those who are mentally suffering, when we see how we're wiping out other species, when we see how we are decimating the ecosphere and leading to the demise of human civilization, and all of this is coming from Eurocentric civilization, spread to America and the rest of the world. then we can really wonder, how civilized are we? If this is the hallmark of what we're doing, that we're destroying the ecosphere and seeing the death knell for our own civilization and the extermination of other species. And so Mahatma Gandhi was once asked, "What do you think of Western civilization?" And he reportedly quipped, "I think it would be a good idea." Any time now you'd like to begin, that would be fine by us, Asians. Got a bit of more time. That was bringing us into the 21st century. Origins of the universe goes back to the Big Bang. The man who formulated that was a Roman Catholic priest, a Belgian physicist. What caused the Big Bang? Don't have a clue. What's out there right now? Location. What's out there? Frankly, they have no agreement at all. Is there even space-time? If there's no space-time, then there's nothing out there at all. But this is what the Mahayana philosophical system has been saying from the get-go. Chittamatra says there is no external physical world at all. All there are is appearances and mind. But it's not out there at all. So physics has been exploring for 400 years a world they think is out there, and it's delusional because there's no world out there. And now we have top-notch physicists saying, yeah. And what happens to the universe? How does it turn out? We know the space-time is expanding, right? Does it go out in a big whimper, which means it continues to expand, 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 and goes stone cold and go out with a big whimper? That's one possibility. But not all cosmologists agree. Another one is that sooner or later there's a tipping point. Gravitation takes over the expanding force, and it contracts into a big crunch. It goes back to a singularity. And that might trigger another one. And then we have an oscillating universe like that. But not everybody agrees. So in terms of origin, the physicists don't really know. Is there a physical universe out there? Don't really know. What happens in the end? Don't know. How about the mind? Where does the mind originate? We have consciousness. My consciousness is not older than 75 years. Where did my consciousness come from? They have not a clue. No idea, no scientific theory. Where is consciousness located? No idea, just beliefs. But no scientific theory that can be tested. What happens to consciousness at death? They have all kinds of beliefs. But that's all they are. There's no scientific knowledge whatsoever in terms of mainstream science about what happens at death. Origin, location, destination of the mind, zip. Origin, location of the physical universe, zip. That's science. Not too late to go to Buddhism. Ready to go back 2,600 years? It's one of my favorite conversations the Buddha had. All-time favorite. I read it years ago. It's the Kesamutiya Sutta, more commonly known as the Kalama Sutta. And this translation is from Bhikkhu Bodhi, one of my favorite scholar translators, monks living today. Ready for another story? It's really a cool story. Here from the Pali Canon, the Anguttara Nikaya. The Kalamas of Kesaputta, the name of the tribe, the community was Kalamas, they live in the town of Kesaputta, said to the Blessed One, Bhante, or teacher, there are some ascetics and Brahmins who come to Kesaputta and they explain and elucidate their own doctrines, but disparage, denigrate, deride, and denounce the doctrines of others. But then some other ascetics and Brahmins come to Kesaputta, and they too explain and elucidate their own doctrines, but disparage, denigrate, deride, and denounce the doctrines of others. We are perplexed and in doubt, Bhante, as to which of these good ascetics speaks truth, and which speaks falsehood. We're hearing all kinds of these dissonant views, and each one is defending their own and pounding and beating up and disparaging others. And now you're one more ascetic or Brahmin, and you're probably going to do the same thing. But before you do, we got some background here. We're feeling a lot of skepticism here, including you. So be careful when you open your mouth, because we've already been there. Bhante, what do you say? And the Buddha replied, it's fitting for you to be perplexed, Kalamas. Fitting for you to be in doubt. Doubt has arisen in you about a perplexing matter. Come, Kalamas, do not go by oral tradition, by lineage of teachings, by hearsay, by a collection of scriptures, by logical reasoning or inferential reasoning, by reasoned cogitation or by the acceptance of a view after pondering it, by seeming competence of a speaker, or because you think the ascetic is our guru. But when Kalamas, you know for yourself, these things are unwholesome, these things are blameworthy, these things are censored by the wise, these things, if accepted and undertaken, lead to harm and suffering, then you should abandon them. He didn't start teaching his own doctrine. Well, I got one better than all the other ones. It's called the Four Noble Truths. So listen up, it's going to blow your mind. He didn't do that. He didn't do that at all. He didn't say anything about, well, my doctrine. The other ones are all wrong, but of course I'm a Buddha. He threw them right back to their own experience, their own first-person experience, conduct. You want to be happy, right? You want to be free of suffering. Don't look outside yourself. Look at things that are wholesome, conducive to well-being, unwholesome, blameworthy, censored by the wise. And if you accept, and if when you embrace them, follow them, it leads to harm and suffering, then you should abandon them. This is radically empirical and radically pragmatic, and it has nothing to do with any doctrine. Atheism, theism, materialism, anything. It's just going right back to your experience. You want to be free of suffering? Then recognize what kinds of actions lead to suffering and abandon them. And you have to decide. I'm not going to tell you the answers at the end of the book. You decide. You look with your own introspection, your own intelligence. You judge what type of conduct from you, and then you can also look outside what kind of conduct from other people leads to misery, to suffering, to conflict, and abandon that. How's that for a start? That's not a doctrine. This is total experience, and you be the judge. And then the Buddha proceeds to ask them. He doesn't answer, he asks them. There's probably like the mayor of the village being the interlocutor. So he addresses him. And he addressed them and he asked them whether the three poisons, lobha, dosa, moha, which we loosely and rather inaccurately translate as attachment, hatred, and delusion. He goes to the three poisons. And he asks them, they know what these terms mean. In Pali, lobha, dosa, moha. These are terms they understood already in their vernacular. So more or less, they got it. First one's often translated as greed, attachment, craving, and so forth, lust. And then he asks them, when any of these three, starting with lobha, craving, attachment, greed, when they arise in one, are they for one's welfare or harm? There's a typo there. Are they for one's welfare or harm? So when you're experiencing greed, attachment, lust, craving, attachment, does that work out well for you or harmful? You decide. I'm not going to tell you. You have to decide this. This is up to you. He comments that a person whose mind is overcome and possessed by them, each of these one by one, greed and then hatred and delusion, this causes them to destroy life. They kill. They kill out of attachment to the homeland and so forth, money, wealth. They kill others. They take what is not given, stealing. They transgresses with another's wife, engage in adultery. They speak falsehood. This gives rise to falsehood. Greed will do it, hatred will do it, delusion will do it. It gives rise to these types of behavior. And a person whose mind is dominated by them not only engages in such behavior that is harmful himself, but also encourages others to do likewise. And we know that's true, right? There's no doctrine and belief system here. This is knowledge. It's 100% knowledge. You either have it or you don't. And then he asks whether that will lead to one's harm and suffering for a long time. You know the short-term consequences. How does it turn out over the long term? When you're going around and killing and lying, stealing, sexual misconduct, and so forth, how does it turn out? Maybe short-term turns out well, you get some money or stuff. How does it turn out over the long term? As a community, as an individual? He's asking them, go back to your experience, and now you answer this. And then he flips it on its head. He said, conversely, he asks, when non-lobha, it's simply a negation, non-attachment, non-hatred, non-delusion. which are not only the absence, but the antidotes too, like venom and antivenom. The non is not simply an absence of, but it's also a direct antidote to. Okay? So when non-lobha arises, is this for one's welfare or harm? And then he comments that a person without lobha, not overcome by lobha, and one's mind not possessed by it, does not destroy life, does not take what is given, does not transgress with another's wife or speak falsehood, and nor does such a person encourage others to do so, or do likewise. And then he asks whether that will lead to his welfare and happiness for a long time. And he poses the same questions with regard to the other two poisons, hatred and delusion. Turning right back to their own experience. You decide, you observe, be discerning, be intelligent, and see for yourself what kinds of behavior. These what we will call mental afflictions and mental poisons, they're not bad because I say so, I the Buddha, or God said so, or some moral system says so. It's totally empirical. If you act out of self-centered greed, craving, lust, grasping, does it turn out well or not? Does it manifest in wholesome and unwholesome behavior or not? If you're cultivating the antidotes to them, how does that turn out? To your benefit, others' benefit, or not? There's no doctrine here. There's no belief here. He's not saying, please believe this. He's saying, look for yourself and know for yourself. Regardless of whatever I think, know for yourself. And at this point, I could go into an absolutely fascinating, detailed account, explanation, bringing out a scalpel, not, oh, we know lobha, that's greed. No, that's not really quite so. Well, it's attachment. Well, attachment theory in psychology is a very good thing. No, it's not that. Desire. No, it's not desire, for heaven's sake. Some people translate lobha as desire. That's nuts. If you're thirsty and you desire some water, oh no, and I'm going to kill and steal and lie, and so come on, give me a break. That's desire. There's nothing wrong with desire. I desire that there can be peace in the world. No, come on. That's really, frankly, that's just stupid. It's one of the worst translations there is of the first of the poisons. It's not desire, way too broad, not just attachment, it's not just greed. We don't have a corresponding term exactly. But when we look at the precise definition, we'll know exactly what it means. Because it's defined in Sanskrit, in Tibetan, and now even in English, because Eva then translated it very well, this whole section, drawn from a modern classic, drawing on the wisdom of Asanga and Dignaga. Precise definitions of each of these poisons. Precise definitions of the antidote, the antithesis, the anti-attachment, anti-hatred, anti-delusion. Precise definitions. Why were we taught this when I was studying at the Institute of Buddhist Dialectics 50 years ago? Well, the real reason they wrote this, taught this, and have continued teaching it for 1,500 years, since the time of Asanga, Dignaga, and Dharmakirti, is not so we learn a doctrine, we become Buddhist, like good Buddhists, I believe whenever they said. It's we take those definitions and apply them to our own experience. That's lobha. We don't quite have an English term, but that's lobha. Yeah, that's really disturbing my mind. Yeah, this could give rise to violence or to stealing. Yeah, it would be this kind of thing. That's what we translate as hatred. That's precise. I've experienced that. Delusion. Oh, yeah, delusion. You're very comfy. Ignorance is bliss, they say. Not really. But that's what they mean by delusion. And then the antidote for each one, that we can cultivate it. It's precise. We don't have time now. It's 3:30. But you can read it. You can read it. And I think that'll be enough. It's a very good translation. She's a superb scholar. Very precise definition. I've given you food for thought for 6 weeks. And I've given you sources. Some really, really cool sources. So the material I've given in the last hour and a half can keep you quite busy, you yogis and yoginis, for 6 weeks. This is food for thought. And it's so rich. I'm not a believer, I'm a Buddhist. Well, most Buddhists like me are believers. If you believe something is true, then you got it for free. Because you believe something was true. You can get benefit from it. Knowledge is much harder. But you can still benefit from an accurate, true, authentic belief. That's good. I'm a believer. A Buddha is not a believer. A Buddha is a knower. Arhats are not believers in the Four Noble Truths. They are knowers of the Four Noble Truths. Yogis are not believers, accomplished yogis who've achieved shamatha, vipassana. They're not believers. And any one yogi who's gained such knowledge of the fusion, the unification of shamatha, vipassana, that person has a lot of knowledge that belongs to that person because of that person's insight, and not because there are other yogis that they know something. And I believe because they said so, like scientists. Most of what scientists think they know, they believe because other scientists know. But the yogis know what they're talking about from the inside. People like Dupamama Karma, deep experience in Shama and Vipassana and Mahamudra and Tummo and the 6 yogas Naropa. Well, there are a lot of yogis like that, but they don't know something that some other yogi knows so. They've spent 20 years in retreat. Gellam Rimba, 25, 30 years in retreat. The people who've gone to the core, they know the core. It's not, I get 10%, you get 10%, and I'll rely on you for 15%. No, it's not like science. Scientific knowledge is collective, and nobody has all of it. But a person who comes to the completion of the path of Buddhahood knows it all. There are believers, and then there are contemplatives. And then the future of human civilization. And if we leave the future of human civilization to believers, especially those who believe in something that's fundamentally delusional, we are doomed. As William James said, and this will be the last quote I give you today, it's short and to the point. I can quote it, but I want to make sure I get it exactly right. Come on. I know you're here. Come back wherever you are. Come out wherever you are. It's here. I'm just not seeing it. What he said was, William James, the end of scientific materialism is tragedy. The end of scientific materialism. It's not quite a perfect quote, but it's very, very, oh, there it is. The essence of scientific materialism is that matter ends in tragedy. Scientific materialism is on a course of tragedy. It's depressing the hell out of us. It's not giving us a clue of the actual sources of unhappiness. Destroying our mental health, destroying the environment, undermining human civilization. That is the track we're on right now. Contemplatives of the world, this is not evangelism for Buddhism. The Buddhist, the Christian, the Hindu, and so on. The contemplatives, great contemplatives of the world, they're the ones who fathom the nature of the mind. Not the scientists. They keep on looking to the west for the rising sun. They're looking at the brain. And they don't learn. They fail and they fail and they fail and keep on doing the same thing. Whereas contemplatives achieve and complete, and they first manifest themselves. You want to see the behavior, the conduct, the presence of an accomplished contemplative. Watch and listen to Khandrola. There's a contemplative. She's a contemplative. So that's it. So I wasn't able to share with you the definitions, but you can read them. And the rest we'll pick up next time. That was the presentation, and there's the refutation of objections. 6 weeks from now, we'll begin with Shantideva. And he's powerful. Gosh, he's powerful. It's the opening lines of the 9th chapter. Spectacular. How contemplatives could save the world. Fathom the mind. Heal the world. And that's what we're here to do. If not us, who? That's it. Voilà, so. Voilà. That's the harvest from the last 6 weeks. But I didn't get all my notes, but most of them. And I have 2.5 pages of auxiliary notes. You get those too, all for free, one bundle. And one presentation of the principles of contemplative science, give you that one for free, and so forth. So you have a nice bundle. The stork will come and land in your inbox, not too long from now, and nourish you for at least another 6 weeks. So that's it. So we're not really finished here, but that's all for now, for those watching the video. I will proceed now to engage in a Guru Yoga practice, but for those watching by way of the internet, this is what I have to offer now. I hope you find it beneficial. I find it magnificent. The Dharma the Buddha taught, the medicine for the modern world, for Buddhists and non-Buddhists alike. So, blessings. Thank you. Let's come back in 15 minutes, and then I'll leave for a while, and then Yangchen will take over. Lasso, that's it.